I'm Paige, and I'm 28 years old. My husband just walked out on me for a woman with a trust fund bigger than our mortgage. And honestly, the text he sent afterward was the real kicker. Enjoy the poverty. Charming, right? 3 years of marriage reduced to a financial status update. But I guess I should have seen it coming when he started working late every night at the same law firm, where Miss Moneybags happened to be a client. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt completely abandoned by someone you trusted. You'll definitely want to stick around for what happened next. Let me back up and tell you how I got here. See, I always believed I was completely alone in this world. Growing up bouncing between foster homes and 2 failed adoptive families will do that to you. The record said my mom died young and my father was unknown. No siblings, no aunts, no uncles, nothing. Just me and a system that couldn't wait to age me out at 18. Maybe that's why I clung so desperately to marriage. For the first time in my life, I had someone who was supposed to be my family. Someone who promised to stick around. Someone who made me feel like I finally belonged somewhere. What a joke that turned out to be. When I met Marcus at 24, I thought I'd hit the jackpot. Tall, successful lawyer, drove a nice car, lived in a decent apartment. More importantly, he seemed genuinely interested in me, not just what I could do for him. I was working 3 part-time jobs just to afford my studio apartment, but Marcus never made me feel ashamed about my background. Well, not until the end, anyway. The divorce was swift and merciless. His lawyer was aggressive, mine was overworked and underpaid. Marcus knew exactly how to play the system, and I didn't have the money to fight back properly. He walked away with the house, most of our shared assets, and apparently zero guilt about leaving me with nothing but a few boxes of personal belongings. But that text message? That was pure Marcus. Always had to have the last word. I stared at those 3 words on my phone screen for a full 5 minutes before deleting them. Enjoy the poverty. Like my financial situation was some kind of vacation I'd chosen. Like being broke was a fun adventure I was embarking on for kicks. The irony wasn't lost on me that the man who'd just ruined me financially was now mocking me for it. But then again, this was the same man who'd convinced me to put the house in his name because his credit score was better. The same man who'd handled all our finances because he was the lawyer and therefore knew best. I should have known better. Should have kept my own accounts, my own credit, my own safety net. But when you grow up with nothing, having someone offer to take care of everything feels like a gift instead of a trap. Now I was 28 years old, homeless, and starting over with less than I'd had at 18. At least back then, I'd had youth and optimism. Now I just had experience and a growing understanding of how naive I'd been. But you know what? I was determined to prove him wrong. I'd survived worse than Marcus Hamilton's betrayal. I'd survived a childhood that would have broken most people. I'd survived being nobody's daughter, nobody's family, nobody's priority. I could survive this too. Or at least that's what I told myself as I packed my Honda Civic with everything I owned and drove away from the life I thought I'd built. Little did I know that in 2 weeks, everything would change in ways I never could have imagined. The apartment I found was what real estate agents generously call cozy, and the rest of us call barely habitable. 600 square feet of questionable plumbing and neighbors who apparently thought 3 a.m. was prime time for practicing their interpretive dance routines. But hey, it was mine. Well, rented. But after sleeping on my coworker's couch for a week, having my own door that locked felt like luxury. I'd managed to land a job at a small marketing firm downtown. The pay was terrible, but it was steady, and my boss seemed decent enough. No health insurance yet. I'd have to wait 3 months for that particular privilege. But I was working, I had a roof over my head, and I hadn't had to ask anyone for help. Small victories, right? The first week was rough. I discovered that my shower only produced hot water between 6:17 and 6:23 a.m., and that my upstairs neighbor apparently owned a bowling ball collection that needed frequent reorganization at midnight. The refrigerator made sounds like a dying walrus, and I'm pretty sure something was living in the walls. But I was making it work. I'd bought a used desk from Craigslist and set up a little workspace by the window. My laptop was ancient, but it functioned well enough for the basic tasks my job required. I'd even managed to find a decent coffee shop nearby where the owner, Mrs. Chen, always threw in an extra shot of espresso when she thought I looked tired. Which was most days, if I'm being honest. The worst part wasn't the living conditions or the financial stress. It was the loneliness. For 3 years, I'd had someone to come home to, someone to share meals with, even if those meals had become increasingly silent toward the end. Someone to fill the quiet spaces that now seemed to echo with my own thoughts. I tried calling a few old friends, but most of them had sided with Marcus in the divorce. Apparently, when you're the one without money or connections, you're also the one without the social circle. Funny how that works. My therapist, the one I could barely afford to see twice a month, kept telling me this was a growth period, a chance to rediscover who I was outside of marriage, an opportunity to build the life I actually wanted instead of the one someone else had chosen for me. Easy for her to say. She wasn't eating ramen noodles for the fourth night in a row. But I was stubborn. I'd always been stubborn. It's probably the only thing that kept me alive in some of those foster homes. So I kept showing up to work, kept paying my bills, kept telling myself that this was just a temporary setback. 2 weeks and 3 days after the divorce was finalized, I was actually starting to believe it might be true. I'd gotten my first full paycheck, managed to buy groceries that included actual vegetables, and even splurged on a small plant for my windowsill. A tiny succulent that the nursery worker promised was impossible to kill. We'd see about that. I was working late that Thursday, trying to finish a presentation for a client meeting the next day. The office was empty except for me and the security guard, who made his rounds every hour like clockwork. I'd become friends with Harold over the past 2 weeks. He was in his 60s, had 3 grandchildren, and always asked about my little plant with genuine interest. By 9:30 p.m., I was finally satisfied with the presentation. My eyes were burning from staring at the computer screen, and I was looking forward to going home, heating up leftover Chinese takeout, and maybe watching something mindless on Netflix. I packed up my things, said goodnight to Harold, and headed for the parking garage. The building was one of those older downtown structures with a parking garage that felt like something out of a horror movie. Dim lighting, concrete walls that echoed every footstep, and a general atmosphere that made you walk a little faster to your car. My Honda was parked on the 3rd level, tucked between a massive SUV and a pickup truck that had seen better days. I'd been proud of that little car. It wasn't much to look at, but it was reliable. And more importantly, it was paid off. One less thing for Marcus to take in the divorce. I threw my bag in the backseat and started the engine. The radio came on automatically, playing some pop song that reminded me of better times. I backed out of the parking space, navigating the narrow garage exit, and headed toward home. The streets were quiet for a Thursday night. Most people were probably home with their families, watching TV, helping kids with homework, living normal lives with normal problems. I wondered if I'd ever have that. If I'd ever trust someone enough to build a life with them again. Probably not. At least not anytime soon. Right now, I just needed to focus on rebuilding, on proving to myself that I could make it alone. I was about 6 blocks from my apartment when it happened. I remember thinking how quiet the intersection was. No other cars in sight, which was unusual for downtown, even at 10 p.m. The light was green, so I maintained my speed through the crosswalk, already mentally planning my evening routine. The last thing I saw was a flash of headlights coming from my right side. No time to brake, no time to swerve, no time to do anything except register that this was really happening. Then everything went black. I found out later that the other driver had been drunk, off-duty construction worker in a pickup truck who'd spent the evening at a bar 6 blocks away, celebrating his buddy's birthday. He'd run a red light at 45 miles per hour and T-boned my Honda directly into the driver's side. The impact crushed my car like a tin can. I don't remember any of it. Not the collision, not the sound of metal crunching, not the sirens that arrived 12 minutes later. My first memory is waking up in a hospital bed 2 days later with more tubes and wires connected to me than I knew existed. Everything hurt. And I mean everything. Breathing hurt. Blinking hurt. Even thinking seemed to cause physical pain that radiated from somewhere deep in my chest. I tried to speak and discovered that was impossible thanks to the breathing tube down my throat. A nurse noticed I was awake and immediately started checking machines and making notes. "Take it easy," she said in that professionally soothing voice medical staff perfect. "You're in the ICU at Portland General. You were in a serious accident, but you're going to be okay." Except I wasn't going to be okay. Not even close. Over the next few hours, as various doctors came and went, I learned just how not okay I was. 3 broken ribs, a punctured lung, severe internal bleeding, and something called a traumatic splenic laceration that had required emergency surgery. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came when Dr. Martinez, a serious-looking woman in her 50s, sat down beside my bed and explained that my spleen had been too damaged to repair. They'd had to remove it entirely, and my other organs had suffered significant trauma from the impact and blood loss. "We've stabilized you for now," she said. "But I need to be honest with you. Your body has been through severe trauma. Your liver and kidneys are showing signs of failure, and frankly, without intervention, your prognosis isn't good." I wanted to ask what kind of intervention. I wanted to know exactly how bad not good meant. But the breathing tube made questions impossible, and the pain medication kept pulling me back toward unconsciousness. Dr. Martinez seemed to understand my unspoken panic. "We're going to do everything we can," she promised, but we may need to consider some aggressive treatment options, including the possibility of organ transplantation if we can't get your organs functioning properly on their own. Transplantation. The word floated around my foggy brain like a foreign concept. I was 28 years old, and apparently my body was failing so catastrophically that they might need to replace parts of it. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, finally starting to rebuild my life, finally proving I could survive on my own, and my own body was betraying me. I drifted in and out of consciousness for the rest of that day, vaguely aware of nurses checking on me, machines beeping, and occasionally a doctor explaining something to someone in hushed tones just outside my room. At some point during the haze, I became aware that someone was trying to contact my emergency contact. Of course, they were having trouble because my emergency contact was still listed as Marcus. Because I'd never gotten around to changing it after the divorce. Because who else would I have listed? The bitter irony cut through even the morphine haze. The man who'd abandoned me, who'd mocked my poverty, was about to get a call that I was dying. I wondered if he'd even bother to show up. Actually, scratch that. I knew he would show up. Not out of concern or love or residual affection, but Marcus was a lawyer, and lawyers understood liability. If his ex-wife died and he was still listed as the emergency contact, there might be paperwork involved. Questions to answer. Legal complications to navigate. Plus, he'd probably be curious. Had to be, right? After sending that cruel text message, after walking away so cleanly, he'd want to see how completely he'd won. Well, congratulations, Marcus. Looks like you were right about my prospects after all. I closed my eyes and let the medication pull me under, wondering if I'd ever wake up again. The call came at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday night. Marcus told me later that he'd been working late, reviewing contracts for a new client, when his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. "Is this Marcus Hamilton?" the voice asked. Professional, clinical, the tone that medical staff use when they have to deliver news no one wants to hear. "Yes, this is Marcus. I'm calling from Portland General Hospital. You're listed as the emergency contact for Paige Hamilton. I'm afraid she's been in a serious accident." Marcus had paused then, according to the nurse I spoke with later. Not the pause of someone processing devastating news about a loved one, more like the pause of someone calculating their legal obligations. "I'm sorry," he'd said finally, "but we're divorced. As of 2 weeks ago. I'm not sure why I'm still listed as her contact." "Sir, regardless of your current relationship status, you're the only contact we have on file. Ms. Hamilton is in critical condition. If you could come to the hospital, we'd appreciate it. There may be decisions that need to be made." Decisions. That word must have triggered something in Marcus's lawyer brain, because 30 minutes later, he was striding through the automatic doors of Portland General's emergency department. I wasn't conscious when he arrived, but the nurses later told me he'd looked exactly like what he was. A successful attorney who'd been inconvenienced by an ex-wife's poor timing, expensive suit, expensive watch, expensive briefcase, and an expression that suggested he had much more important places to be. He'd identified himself at the reception desk and been directed to the ICU, where Dr. Martinez had been waiting to brief whoever showed up. "Are you Ms. Hamilton's husband?" she'd asked. "Ex-husband," Marcus had corrected quickly. "We divorced 2 weeks ago. I'm only here because apparently she never updated her emergency contact information." Dr. Martinez had looked at him with the kind of expression that medical professionals reserve for particularly unpleasant relatives. "I see. Well, since you're here, let me explain Ms. Hamilton's condition." Marcus later admitted to a colleague, who later admitted to my former coworker who eventually told me that he'd expected to find me with a few broken bones and maybe a concussion. Something dramatic enough to warrant the emergency call but ultimately minor. Something he could handle with a brief visit and perhaps a referral to a good orthopedic surgeon. What Dr. Martinez described was nothing like what he'd imagined. Ms. Hamilton sustained massive internal trauma in the collision, the doctor had explained. "We've removed her spleen, but she's experiencing multi-organ failure. Her liver and kidneys are severely compromised, and frankly, without immediate intervention, her prognosis is very poor." "What kind of intervention?" "Transplantation. Possibly multiple organs depending on how her body responds over the next 48 hours. Marcus had stared at her. This was not the minor inconvenience he'd been prepared to handle. This was not something that could be resolved with a quick visit and a clean exit. Is she going to die?" Dr. Martinez had given him the look that doctors give when they're about to deliver the kind of news that changes everything. "Without compatible donors? Yes. Very likely." That's when Marcus had asked the question that would change everything. What are the chances of finding compatible donors? Organ compatibility is complex, Dr. Martinez had explained. Blood type, tissue matching, various genetic factors. We've put her on the transplant waiting lists, but given the severity of her condition and the need for multiple organs, she'd trailed off, but the implication was clear. However, she'd continued, we have initiated testing that might help us identify potential matches more quickly. We've submitted her genetic profile to several national databases, including some private registries that maintain more extensive genetic information. Marcus had nodded, probably thinking this was just standard medical procedure. He had no idea that those genetic databases were about to reveal information that would turn his entire world upside down. There is one more thing, Dr. Martinez had said. Given the complexity of her case and the potential need for family medical history, we're running comprehensive genetic screening. Sometimes family members can be compatible donors, or at least provide medical information that helps with treatment decisions. She doesn't have any family, Marcus had said automatically. She grew up in foster care. Parents unknown. Dr. Martinez had made a note in her chart. I see. Well, the genetic testing may still provide useful medical information. We should have preliminary results within 24 to 48 hours. Marcus had left the hospital that night thinking he'd done his duty. He'd shown up, he'd been briefed on the situation, he'd provided what little information he could. His legal and moral obligations had been fulfilled. He had no idea that in less than 24 hours, everything he thought he knew about his ex-wife was about to be proven spectacularly wrong. The genetic testing results came back faster than anyone expected. Dr. Martinez later told me that she'd never seen a genetic database match return so quickly or with such definitive results. Marcus was in his office the next morning, probably trying to forget all about his inconvenient hospital visit, when his phone rang again. Mr. Hamilton, this is Dr. Martinez from Portland General. I need you to come back to the hospital as soon as possible. Has her condition changed? Not exactly. But the genetic testing has revealed some information that you need to hear in person. How quickly can you get here? Something in her tone must have caught his attention because he cleared his calendar and arrived at the hospital within an hour. Dr. Martinez met him in a private consultation room, not the ICU. She had a folder in her hands and an expression that Marcus later described as carefully neutral. Mr. Hamilton, the genetic testing we performed on Ms. Hamilton has revealed some unexpected information. What kind of information? We submitted her DNA profile to several databases looking for potential compatible donors or family medical history. What we found was a direct genetic match to someone whose profile was already in the system. Marcus had leaned forward, probably wondering where this was going. Ms. Hamilton is the biological daughter of Harrison Blackwood. The name meant nothing to Marcus at first. He'd stared at Dr. Martinez blankly, waiting for additional explanation. Harrison Blackwood, she'd repeated. The real estate mogul. He passed away 4 months ago. That's when it clicked. Harrison Blackwood hadn't just been any real estate mogul. He'd been the real estate mogul. The man who'd built an empire of commercial properties across the Pacific Northwest before expanding nationally. The man whose death had been front-page news because he died without any known heirs, leaving behind a fortune estimated at over $2 billion. Marcus's mouth had gone dry. That's impossible, he'd said. Paige grew up in foster care. She doesn't have any family. Her mother died when she was young, and her father was unknown. Dr. Martinez had opened the folder and shown him the genetic analysis. The DNA doesn't lie, Mr. Hamilton. Ms. Hamilton is Harrison Blackwood's biological daughter. The match is unmistakable. But how is that possible? Wouldn't he have known about her? According to the information we've been able to gather, Ms. Hamilton's mother, Sarah Chen, worked as a secretary in one of Mr. Blackwood's companies 30 years ago. There's no indication that Mr. Blackwood was ever informed of the pregnancy. Ms. Chen died when Ms. Hamilton was 3, and she was placed into foster care with no information about her father's identity. Marcus had sat in stunned silence, trying to process what this meant. Mr. Hamilton, Dr. Martinez had continued, there's something else you need to understand. Harrison Blackwood's estate has been in probate for the past 4 months. His lawyers have been unable to identify any living heirs. Without a biological child or designated heir, his entire fortune was set to go to various charities. The implications were staggering. You're saying Paige is entitled to inherit his entire estate? I'm saying she's his biological daughter, which means she has a legal claim to his inheritance. But right now, that's not our primary concern. Our primary concern is saving her life. Dr. Martinez had closed the folder and looked directly at Marcus. Mr. Hamilton, the genetic match we found wasn't just with Harrison Blackwood. It was also with compatible donors in our private transplant networks. Mr. Blackwood had signed up for several organ donor registries, and his genetic profile helped us identify potentially compatible donors in our system. So she might survive? Her chances just improved dramatically. We've identified 3 potential organ donors whose genetic profiles suggest strong compatibility. We're arranging emergency transplant procedures within the next 48 hours. Marcus had left that meeting in a daze. His ex-wife, the woman he'd mocked for her poverty, the woman he'd abandoned for someone with a trust fund, was apparently the daughter of one of the wealthiest men in the country, and he'd just learned this information while she was lying unconscious in the ICU, possibly dying. The irony was so brutal it was almost poetic. Marcus spent the rest of that day making phone calls, first to estate lawyers, trying to understand the implications of what he'd learned, then to his own financial advisors, probably calculating what this might mean for him, because Marcus was nothing if not practical. By evening, he'd confirmed what Dr. Martinez had told him. Harrison Blackwood had died intestate, without a will designating heirs. His biological daughter would indeed be entitled to inherit his entire fortune, provided she could prove paternity, and provided she survived long enough to make a claim. That's when Marcus started crying. Not from relief that I might survive, but from the crushing realization of what he'd thrown away. He'd walked away from a potential billionaire because he thought she was poor. The next morning, he came back to the hospital, not as my ex-husband fulfilling an obligation, but as a man who suddenly understood he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. He sat in the waiting room outside the ICU, still in his expensive suit, still carrying his expensive briefcase, but looking like a man who'd been hit by a truck, which, in a way, he had been. I woke up slowly the second time, emerging from unconsciousness like surfacing from deep water. The breathing tube was gone, which was an improvement, but everything still hurt with the intensity that made thinking difficult. But there were new sounds. Machines I hadn't heard before, voices speaking in urgent medical terminology just outside my room. Something had changed while I was under. Dr. Martinez appeared at my bedside with what I can only describe as cautiously optimistic expression. "Paige," she said softly, "how are you feeling?" I tried to speak and managed a hoarse whisper. "Like I got hit by a truck. Close. Pickup truck, actually." She smiled at my attempt at humor. "I have some important news for you. Good news." Good news seemed impossible given my current situation, but I waited for her to continue. "We've identified compatible organ donors. We're going to perform emergency transplant surgery within the next few hours. Your chances of survival have improved significantly." Relief flooded through me. I was going to live. Maybe. Probably. The details seemed less important than the basic fact that I had a chance. "How?" I whispered. "We'll discuss the details later after your surgery. Right now, I need you to focus on getting ready. The surgical team is preparing, and we'll be taking you into the OR shortly." As they wheeled me toward surgery, I caught a glimpse of Marcus sitting in the waiting room. He looked terrible. Disheveled, exhausted, like he hadn't slept in days. Our eyes met briefly, and I saw something in his expression that I couldn't quite identify. Regret, maybe, or fear, or guilt, probably all of the above. The surgery took 14 hours. I found out later that they replaced my damaged liver and one of my kidneys with organs from donors whose genetic profiles were so compatible that rejection was highly unlikely. The surgical team had called it one of the most successful emergency transplant procedures they'd ever performed. When I woke up, Marcus was sitting beside my bed. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his hair was disheveled, and he was holding my hand like it was the most precious thing in the world. "Paige," he said when he saw my eyes open. His voice was thick with emotion. "Thank God," I thought. I was so scared that he was crying. Actually crying. Marcus Hamilton, who I'd never seen show genuine emotion in 3 years of marriage, was sitting beside my hospital bed with tears streaming down his face. "Marcus?" My voice was still weak but clearer than before. "What are you doing here?" "I never left," he said. "Not since they called me. I've been here the whole time." That didn't make sense. Marcus didn't do bedside vigils. Marcus did legal obligations and clean exits. Marcus did not sit in hospital waiting rooms crying over ex-wives. "I don't understand." He squeezed my hand, and I noticed his wedding ring was back on his finger. That definitely didn't make sense. "Paige, there's something I need to tell you. Something the doctors discovered when they ran your genetic testing for the transplant." I waited, confusion and pain medication making it hard to focus. "You're not who you think you are," he said softly. "I mean, you are, but your father wasn't unknown. The genetic testing identified him." "What are you talking about?" Marcus took a deep breath. "Your biological father was Harrison Blackwood." The name sounded familiar, but I couldn't place it through the medication haze. "The real estate developer," Marcus continued. "He died 4 months ago without any known heirs. He was worth over $2 billion. The words hung in the air like something from a dream. $2 billion. My father. The man I'd never known. "Paige," Marcus said, his voice breaking, "you're not poor. You never were poor. You're one of the wealthiest women in the country." I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. The foster homes, the struggle, the desperate need to make my marriage work because I had nothing else. All of it had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of who I was. The inheritance, I whispered. It's yours. All of it. The lawyers are already working on the paperwork, but with the genetic proof, there's no question. You're his daughter, his only heir. Marcus was still crying, still holding my hand like I might disappear. I'm so sorry, he whispered. I'm so sorry for everything. For the divorce, for the things I said, for abandoning you when you needed me most. I was such a fool. I looked at his face, at the genuine anguish there, and finally understood what I was seeing. Marcus Hamilton had just realized he'd thrown away the biggest prize of his life for a woman whose trust fund was pocket change compared to what I was now worth, and he wanted me back. The irony was so perfect, it would have been funny if it weren't so pathetic. I closed my eyes, feeling something inside me shift. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but a kind of cold clarity that cut through both the pain medication and the shock of the news. When I opened my eyes again, Marcus was still there, still waiting for my response, but I already knew what it was going to be. I looked at Marcus sitting there with his wedding ring back on, tears streaming down his face, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, complete and utter clarity. You put your ring back on? I said quietly. He glanced down at his hand like he'd forgotten. Paige, I never should have taken it off. I made the biggest mistake of my life. When did you put it back on, Marcus? Before or after you found out about the money? His face flushed. It's not about the money. I almost laughed. Almost. Really? Because 2 weeks ago you sent me a text telling me to enjoy my poverty. Now suddenly you remember you love me? What a coincidence. I was angry. I said things I didn't mean. No, I said, my voice getting stronger despite the pain medication. You said exactly what you meant. You meant every word of that divorce. You meant every cruel comment, every dismissive look, every moment you made me feel like I wasn't enough. Marcus leaned forward, desperation clear in his eyes. Paige, please, we can start over. We can make this work. We? I raised an eyebrow. There is no we anymore, Marcus. You made sure of that when you chose your client over your wife. But now things are different. You understand that, right? Everything's changed. You're absolutely right. Everything has changed. I shifted in the hospital bed, ignoring the pain that shot through my side. I've changed. I've learned something very important about myself. He waited, probably hoping I was about to forgive him. I've learned that I don't need anyone else to validate my worth. For years, I thought I needed you to feel complete. I thought I needed our marriage to feel like I had a family. But you know what I realized while I was dying on that operating table? Marcus's face went pale. I realized that I've been my own family all along. I've been surviving and thriving on my own since I was 18 years old. I built a life, a career, a sense of self-worth that had nothing to do with you or anyone else. Paige, I'm not finished. My voice cut through his interruption like a blade. The money doesn't change who I am, Marcus. It just reveals who you are. And who you are is a man who only loves people when they can benefit him, financially. The machines around my bed beeped steadily, marking time in what felt like the most important conversation of my life. That's not fair, he said weakly. Fair? I smiled, and it wasn't a nice smile. You want to talk about fair? Was it fair when you convinced me to put our house in your name? Was it fair when you used your legal connections to make sure I got nothing in the divorce? Was it fair when you sent me that text message? Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but I wasn't done. Here's what's going to happen. Marcus, you're going to leave this hospital. You're going to go home to your new girlfriend with the trust fund. And you're going to forget my phone number, my address, and my existence. You can't be serious. Oh, I'm deadly serious. Pun intended. I gestured weakly at the machines surrounding me. Because unlike you, I actually did almost die. And funny thing about near-death experiences, they really clarify what matters and what doesn't. A nurse appeared in the doorway, probably drawn by the tension in the room. Everything okay in here? She asked. Actually, yes, I said, not taking my eyes off Marcus. Mr. Hamilton was just leaving, permanently. Marcus stood up slowly, his expensive suit wrinkled from sitting in a hospital chair for hours. Paige, I know you're angry, but when you've had time to think about this, what do you think will happen when I'm thinking more clearly, Marcus? I interrupted. What do you think I'll realize? Do you think I'll suddenly forget how easily you threw me away? Do you think money will make me stupid enough to trust you again? He had no answer for that. Goodbye, Marcus. Enjoy the trust fund. He walked toward the door, then turned back one last time. I'll wait, he said. However long it takes, I'll wait for you to forgive me. I smiled at him with genuine amusement. No, you won't. Because I'm about to become a very public, very wealthy woman. And you know what happens to guys like you when women like me become unavailable? You find the next opportunity? You always do. After he left, I closed my eyes and felt something I hadn't experienced in months: peace. For the first time since I'd woken up in this hospital bed, I wasn't thinking about survival or fear or pain. I was thinking about possibilities. The lawyers arrived 3 days later, and honestly, they looked exactly like what I'd expected lawyers representing a $2 billion estate to look like. Expensive suits, leather briefcases, and the kind of confidence that comes from handling more money than most people see in a lifetime. "Ms. Hamilton," the lead attorney said, extending his hand. "I'm Jonathan Pierce from Pierce, Morrison and Associates. We represent the Blackwood estate." I shook his hand from my hospital bed, still connected to enough machines to power a small aircraft. "I'm assuming you're not here to congratulate me on my recovery?" He smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from a lawyer in months. "Actually, that's exactly why I'm here. Your recovery is remarkable, and it's also legally significant." The second lawyer, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes, pulled up a chair. "Ms. Hamilton, I'm Sarah Morrison. We've been waiting to meet you for quite some time." "Waiting to meet me? I only found out who my father was 3 days ago." "We've been searching for you for 4 months, Jonathan explained, "ever since your father passed away. We knew he had a daughter. We had records indicating a relationship with a Sarah Chen in the early 90s, but the trail went cold when she died." I stared at them. "You've been looking for me?" "Intensively," Sarah said. "We hired private investigators, genealogists, anyone who might be able to trace your whereabouts. When the hospital contacted us about the genetic match from your medical tests, it confirmed what we'd been hoping to find." "Wait, hold on. The hospital contacted you?" "Standard procedure in cases involving potential inheritance claims," Jonathan explained. "When genetic testing identifies a possible familial relationship to someone with a significant estate in probate, there are legal protocols to follow." That made more sense than the fairy tale version Marcus had probably heard. "So this inheritance, it's real?" Sarah opened her briefcase and pulled out a folder thick enough to use as a doorstop. "Ms. Hamilton, your father was worth approximately $2.3 billion at the time of his death. Real estate holdings, investment portfolios, business interests, and liquid assets." The number hit me like a physical force. I'd heard Marcus say $2 billion, but hearing it from the actual lawyers made it real in a way that hospital drugs and emotional exhaustion hadn't allowed me to process. "And all of this is mine? With some conditions," Jonathan said. "Your father's will was complex. He'd updated it several times over the years, but the most recent version, dated 6 months before his death, specifically provides for any biological children who might be discovered after his passing." "He knew about me?" "Not specifically," Sarah said gently, "but he suspected he might have children he'd never met. The will includes provisions for genetic testing and inheritance rights for any proven biological offspring." I leaned back against my pillows, trying to process this information. "What kind of conditions?" "Nothing onerous," Jonathan assured me. "Primarily restrictions designed to protect the assets from fortune hunters or questionable influences." He gave me a meaningful look. "For example, any spouse or partner you have must sign agreements confirming they have no claim to the inherited assets." I couldn't help it. I laughed. "Well, that's not going to be a problem. My ex-husband just spent the last 3 days trying to convince me to take him back because of the money." The lawyers exchanged a glance. "We've heard about Mr. Hamilton," Sarah said carefully. "Should we be concerned about any legal claims he might attempt to make?" "None whatsoever," I said firmly. "Our divorce was finalized 2 weeks ago. He walked away with everything we'd accumulated during the marriage, and I signed papers confirming I had no claim to his assets or income. Works both ways." "Excellent," Jonathan said, making notes. "There are some other details we need to discuss. Tax implications, trust structures, management of the various business interests, but those can wait until you're feeling stronger." "There's one more thing," Sarah said. "Your father left a letter, specifically for any children who might be found after his death. Would you like to read it now, or wait until you're home?" My throat tightened unexpectedly. A letter from the father I'd never known, written for children he'd hoped existed. "Now," I said. "I'd like to read it now." Sarah handed me a sealed envelope with my father's law firm letterhead. Inside was a single sheet of paper, written in careful handwriting. "To my child," it began. "If you are reading this, it means I am gone, and you have been found. I want you to know that not a day passed that I didn't wonder about you, didn't hope you were safe and happy and loved. I failed you by not being there, but I hope this inheritance can provide you with the security and opportunities I was never able to give you personally. Use it wisely, use it well, and know that you were wanted even if you were unknown. With all my love, Harrison Blackwood." I folded the letter carefully, my vision blurring with tears that had nothing to do with pain medication. "He sounds like he was a good man," I said finally. "He was," Jonathan confirmed. "And judging by what we've learned about you, I think he would have been very proud. What do you think will happen next? Drop a comment below. Will Paige be able to handle this massive change in her life, or will her past catch up with her in unexpected ways?" Recovery was slow, but every day I felt a little stronger, a little more like myself. The doctors were amazed by how well my body was responding to the transplanted organs. "Remarkably compatible," they kept saying, like I'd won some kind of genetic lottery, which I suppose I had. The lawyers visited every few days, gradually explaining the complexity of what I'd inherited. It wasn't just money, it was an empire. Commercial real estate from Seattle to Miami, residential developments, shopping centers, office buildings, investment portfolios that generated more money in a month than I'd earned in my entire life. "The good news," Sarah explained during one visit, "is that your father built excellent management systems. The businesses essentially run themselves with very capable teams in place. You don't need to become a real estate mogul overnight." "But I could if I wanted to." "You could do anything you wanted to," Jonathan confirmed. "That's the point of this kind of wealth. It's not just money, it's freedom. Freedom." I tested the word in my mind like I was learning a new language. The press found out about the inheritance on my 6th day in the hospital. I woke up to find reporters camped outside the building, and my phone buzzing with calls from numbers I didn't recognize. "Ms. Hamilton, can you comment on your inheritance? What are your plans for the Blackwood fortune? Is it true you were living in poverty before the accident?" That last question made me want to throw something. Living in poverty. Like my entire life had been some kind of tragic backstory that led to this moment of revelation. The hospital security kept them away from my floor, but I could see them on the news, speculating about the mysterious daughter of Harrison Blackwood. They'd already dug up photos of Marcus and me from our wedding, pictures from my LinkedIn profile, even managed to find my college graduation photo somehow. Cinderella story, unknown, heiress inherits billions. From foster care to fortune, the Paige Hamilton story. Rags to riches, accident reveals billion-dollar inheritance. I turned off the TV after the third news segment. The story they were telling wasn't wrong exactly, but it wasn't mine either. They made it sound like some kind of fairy tale, complete with evil stepfamily and a magical transformation. Real life was messier than that. My phone rang. A number I actually recognized. My former coworker Lisa from the marketing firm. "Oh my God, Paige, I just saw the news. Is it real? Are you really worth billions?" "Hi, Lisa. Yes, it's real." "That's incredible. You must be so happy." I considered the question. Was I happy? I was alive, which was more than I'd expected a week ago. I was financially secure in ways I'd never dreamed possible. I had control over my life for the first time since, maybe ever, but happy felt like too simple a word for what I was experiencing. "I'm grateful," I said finally, "and I'm hopeful." "What are you going to do first? Buy a mansion? A yacht? Travel the world?" "First, I'm going to get out of this hospital bed and learn to walk again without feeling like someone's using my ribcage as a xylophone." Lisa laughed. "Right, of course. I'm sorry, this must all be so overwhelming." "It is, but not in the way you'd think." After I hung up, I lay back and stared at the ceiling. The truth was, the money wasn't the overwhelming part. The overwhelming part was realizing how completely I'd been living my life for other people's approval. I'd married Marcus because I thought having a husband would make me complete. I'd stayed in a job I didn't love because it was safe. I'd accepted less than I deserved because I'd been taught that wanting more was selfish. But here I was, lying in a hospital bed, worth more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. And for the first time in my adult life, the only person whose approval I needed was my own. A knock on my door interrupted my thoughts. A young nurse I hadn't met before peeked in. "Ms. Hamilton, there's someone here to see you. Says he's your brother?" "Brother? I didn't have any brothers." "What's his name?" "Marcus Hamilton. He says it's urgent." I felt my jaw tighten. "Could you tell Mr. Hamilton that he's not my brother, he's my ex-husband, and he's not welcome here? And could you also make sure security knows he's not authorized to visit me?" The nurse's eyes widened slightly. "Of course. I'm so sorry." "Not your fault," I said. "He's persistent." After she left, I picked up my phone and called the lawyers. "Jonathan, it's Paige. I think I need to discuss those protection clauses you mentioned." 3 weeks later, I was finally released from the hospital. The media circus had calmed down somewhat, though photographers still lurked around any building I entered. Jonathan had arranged for a private security detail, 2 discreet professionals who blended into the background but could handle any situation that arose. "Think of them as insurance," he'd said. When you're worth this much money, you attract all kinds of attention, most of it harmless, but some of it potentially problematic. I'd moved into a downtown hotel suite while my lawyers handled purchasing a house. Not a mansion. I wasn't ready for that level of change yet. But a nice place in a good neighborhood with actual security systems and neighbors who minded their own business. The strangest part wasn't the money or the security or even the constant attention. The strangest part was how normal I felt most of the time. I still preferred coffee from my usual cafe, still read the news on my phone in the morning, still found hospital food disgusting. Money didn't change your personality, I was learning. It just revealed parts of it you'd never had the opportunity to explore. There's something we need to discuss, Sarah said during our morning meeting at the lawyer's office. We've received several communications from Marcus Hamilton's attorney. I set down my coffee. What kind of communications? Claims of financial entitlement based on your marriage. Requests for reconciliation mediation. Suggestions that the divorce settlement should be revisited given your changed circumstances. Are you kidding me? I'm afraid not. His lawyer is arguing that since the inheritance was discovered while you were technically still his emergency contact, there might be grounds for him to claim a portion of the assets. I stared at her. That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. It is ridiculous, Jonathan agreed, entering the conference room with a stack of papers. It's also legally baseless, but it means we need to be proactive about shutting this down before it becomes a bigger problem. What do you recommend? A cease and desist order. Make it clear that any further attempts to claim your inherited assets will result in legal action for harassment. Also, we should consider a restraining order if he continues trying to contact you directly. I thought about Marcus sitting in that hospital chair, crying about his mistakes, swearing he'd changed. Apparently, he'd changed right back. Do it. All of it. There's something else, Sarah said carefully. We've received inquiries from several individuals claiming to be your relatives. Foster families, former classmates, even someone claiming to be your birth mother's cousin. None of them are real, are they? Unlikely. We're having them all investigated, but it's a common occurrence when someone receives a large inheritance. People come out of the woodwork with dubious claims and emotional manipulation. Wonderful. So I've gone from having no family to having a bunch of fake family members who want my money. Jonathan smiled sympathetically. The good news is that we're very good at identifying and eliminating these kinds of claims. The bad news is that it's probably going to continue for a while. How long is a while? Could be months, maybe longer. Money brings out both the best and worst in people, and unfortunately, you're going to see more of the worst than most people do. I leaned back in the conference room chair. Leather. Expensive, the kind of chair I'd never imagined sitting in during a meeting about my own assets. And considered this information. You know what? I said finally. I think I can handle a few fortune hunters and an ex-husband with delusions of grandeur. After all, I survived Marcus the first time around. I can certainly survive him now that I know exactly what he's worth. Which is? Sarah asked. I smiled. Absolutely nothing. 2 hours later, I was back in my hotel suite when my phone rang. Unknown number, but I'd learned to answer them in case they were legitimate business calls. Paige? The voice was familiar, though I couldn't place it immediately. It's David Chen, Sarah's cousin. We met at her funeral when you were little. Sarah's cousin, my mother's cousin, someone who would have been the closest thing to family I'd had for the first few years of my life. I'm sorry, I said. I don't remember. Of course not. You were so young, but I've been following the news and I wanted to reach out. I have some things of your mother's that I think you should have. Photos, letters, things the state didn't take when they placed you in foster care. My heart stopped. Photos of my mother, letters, pieces of a life I'd never known existed. I'd like to see them, I said. Of course. Why don't we meet for coffee? There's so much I'd like to tell you about Sarah. She was such a wonderful person, and you look just like her. I hung up the phone with shaking hands. Then I called Jonathan. I need you to investigate someone, I said. His name is David Chen, and he claims to be my mother's cousin. Because if there was one thing I'd learned about sudden wealth, it was that everyone who approached you had an agenda. Even the ones who offered you exactly what you'd been hoping for your entire life. David Chen turned out to be exactly who he claimed to be. My mother's cousin, a retired teacher living in Vancouver, who had indeed kept a small box of her belongings for nearly 30 years. I always hoped someone would find you, he told me as we sat in a small cafe near his apartment. Sarah talked about you constantly in the letters she sent before she died. You were the center of her world. The box contained photographs I'd never seen. My mother holding me as a baby, laughing at something off camera, me taking my first steps in what looked like a small apartment, a photo of my mother reading to me, both of us curled up on a couch, but it was the letters that broke my heart and healed it at the same time. My dearest David, one of them read, Paige said mama today for the first time, and I cried for 20 minutes. I know she won't remember this when she grows up, but I want her to know that every moment with her is precious. I want her to know that she is loved completely, even if I can't give her all the things other children have. There were dozens of them. Letters describing my first smile, my first tooth, my first attempt to climb out of my crib. Letters full of hopes and dreams for the daughter she wouldn't live to raise. She never mentioned your father, David said quietly. Not once, in any of the letters. But she did say that she hoped someday you'd understand that love doesn't always come in the package we expect. I wiped tears from my cheeks, not caring that we were in a public cafe. She wanted you to have this, David said, pulling out a small silver locket. It was her mother's, your grandmother's. She made me promise that if anything happened to her, I'd find a way to get it to you. Inside the locket was a photo of my mother as a young woman, smiling at the camera with the same eyes I saw in the mirror every day. Why didn't you find me sooner? I asked. David sighed. I tried. For years, I tried. But the foster system, they said it was better for children to make clean breaks from their past. They wouldn't tell me where you'd been placed. And by the time I could afford to hire investigators, the trail had gone cold. You hired investigators? A retired teacher doesn't have the same resources as a billionaire's estate, he said with a gentle smile. But I never stopped hoping. We spent 3 hours in that cafe, and David told me stories about my mother that filled in pieces of a puzzle I'd been trying to solve my entire life. She'd been funny, stubborn, fiercely independent. She'd worked 2 jobs while raising me alone, determined to provide for her daughter without depending on anyone else. She sounds like someone I would have liked, I said. You would have adored each other, David confirmed. And she would be so proud of the woman you've become. When I got back to the hotel that evening, I called Jonathan. I want to do something with the inheritance, I said. Something that would have made my mother proud. What did you have in mind? A foundation for kids aging out of foster care, educational scholarships, housing assistance, job training, all the things I wish I'd had when I was 18 and suddenly on my own. That's a beautiful idea. Paige, your father would have approved too. He was actually quite philanthropic, though he kept it private. How much of the inheritance could I dedicate to something like that? As much as you want. It's your money. I looked at the photos David had given me, spread out on the hotel room's desk. My mother and me frozen in moments of happiness that I'd never known existed. I want to start with $100 million, I said. And I want to call it the Sarah Chen Foundation. We can make that happen. There's one more thing, I said. I want to buy Marcus's law firm. Jonathan was quiet for a moment. Buy his firm? May I ask why? I smiled at my reflection in the hotel window, looking out at a city that suddenly felt full of possibilities rather than obstacles. Because I want him to spend the rest of his career working for the woman he told to enjoy her poverty, and because I think it's time he learned what it feels like to have his financial security depend on someone else's goodwill. That's remarkably satisfying as a concept, Jonathan said, and probably quite feasible. His firm isn't particularly large or successful. Make it happen, I said. I want to own it by the end of the month. And Marcus? Will keep his job as long as he follows the rules. I believe in second chances. Jonathan, I just don't believe in giving them to people who haven't earned them. After I hung up, I opened the silver locket and looked at my mother's photo again. I'm going to be okay, Mom, I whispered to the picture. We're both going to be okay now. 6 months later, I stood in front of the newly opened Sarah Chen Foundation offices, cutting a ribbon while photographers captured the moment. The building was beautiful, modern, welcoming, designed to make young people feel hopeful rather than intimidated when they walked through the doors. This foundation will provide comprehensive support for young adults transitioning out of foster care, I told the gathered crowd. Educational scholarships, housing assistance, job training, mental health services, and most importantly, a community of people who understand what it's like to navigate the world without a family safety net. In the audience, I spotted David Chen, beaming with pride. Next to him sat Dr. Martinez, who had become an unexpected friend during my recovery. Jonathan and Sarah were there too, along with several young people who would be the foundation's first scholarship recipients. And in the back, barely visible behind a pillar, stood Marcus. He'd been working at his law firm, my law firm, for 3 months now. I'd promoted his former boss and made Marcus a junior associate, reporting to the woman who used to be his secretary. He'd never said a word of complaint, never filed a grievance, never done anything except show up to work every day and do his job. I'd heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd broken up with the trust fund girlfriend. Apparently, she'd lost interest when she realized he was no longer the successful attorney she'd thought she was dating, but rather an employee whose job security depended on his ex-wife's continued goodwill. Ironic how that worked. After the ceremony, as people mingled and toured the foundation offices, Marcus approached me. "It's beautiful," he said quietly. "What you've built here. Your mother would be proud." I studied his face. He looked older, more tired, but also somehow more genuine than I'd seen him in years. "Thank you," I said. "I know I have no right to ask," he continued, "but I wanted you to know that I've learned something over the past few months, which is that the woman I fell in love with 8 years ago was already extraordinary. I just couldn't see it because I was too focused on what I thought success should look like." I nodded. "I've learned something too, Marcus." He waited. "I learned that forgiveness isn't about pretending someone didn't hurt you. It's about choosing not to let their actions define your future." "Does that mean?" "It means you'll always have a job at the firm, as long as you do good work and treat people with respect. It means I hope you find someone who values you for who you are, not what you can provide. And it means I'm grateful for the lessons our marriage taught me, even though I wouldn't choose to learn them that way again." Marcus nodded slowly. "And us?" "There is no us, Marcus. There hasn't been for a long time, but there doesn't have to be animosity either." He smiled sadly. "I think that's more than I deserve, probably, but it's what I'm willing to give." As the evening wound down and people began to leave, I stood alone in the foundation's main conference room, looking at the portrait we'd hung on the wall. It was the photo of my mother holding me as a baby, professionally printed and beautifully framed. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Saw the news about the foundation. Proud of you. H." I stared at the message for a moment before realizing what it meant. H. Harold, the security guard from my old job who'd always asked about my little plant. Somehow, he'd tracked down my number just to say he was proud. I typed back, "Thank you. That means more than you know." Then I turned off my phone and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city. Somewhere out there were young people aging out of foster care, facing the same fears and uncertainties I'd faced at 18. Tomorrow, they'd have a place to turn for help. Somewhere out there was Marcus, driving home to an apartment he could barely afford, working for the woman he'd once dismissed. He'd learn, eventually, that real success wasn't about accumulating power over others, but about using whatever power you had to lift people up. And somewhere out there were other stories waiting to unfold. Other people whose lives would change in ways they couldn't imagine. Other second chances, other revelations, other moments when everything you thought you knew turned out to be wrong. I touched the silver locket at my throat, feeling the weight of my mother's photo inside. "Thank you," I whispered to her memory, to my father's memory, to the accident that had nearly killed me but instead revealed who I really was. Then I walked out of the foundation offices and into a future that was entirely my own. 3 years later, the Sarah Chen Foundation had helped over 2,000 young adults transition successfully out of foster care. Marcus had been promoted back to senior associate after proving himself capable of empathy as well as legal expertise. And me? I was still Paige Hamilton, still stubborn, still sarcastic, still learning to navigate a world that had turned upside down in the space of a few weeks. But I was no longer alone, no longer afraid, and no longer willing to accept less than I deserved from anyone, including myself, which, as it turned out, was the most valuable inheritance of all. If this story resonated with you, make sure to like and subscribe for more incredible true stories of transformation and resilience. And remember, sometimes the worst thing that happens to you leads directly to the best thing that ever could.